Hello, and welcome to the COE Lecture Series, brought to you by the University of Georgia College of Education. For this episode, we bring you the second of two talks presented by Dr. Sonia Nieto, Professor Emerita of Language, Literacy, and Culture in the School of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Nieto is also one of the leading researchers, writers, and teachers in the field of multiculturalism. Her topic for today's talk, Aha Moments in Personal, Sociocultural, and Sociopolitical Awareness.
Oh, thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you all for being here. Let's hope the fire marshal doesn't come by. So I'm going to read most of my talk, so bear with me. And the title is Language, Literacy, and Culture, Aha Moments in Personal, Sociocultural, and Sociopolitical Understanding or Awareness. So this is largely autobiographical and theoretical, I hope, and I'll tell you what I think are the limits of autobiography, but also what we can learn from it. So my talk today focuses on the intersections among language, literacy, and culture, and what these intersections have meant for me, and I hope what they can also mean for many others who've been marginalized, neglected, or made invisible by traditional understandings of the role of education. These areas of study, language, literacy, and culture, haven't always been linked conceptually or programmatically, but they certainly have been in the last 10 to 20 years. And numerous scholars and educators are beginning to reflect a growing awareness of the promise that they hold for rethinking teaching and learning. I think that linking these issues gives us a richer picture of learning, especially for students whose identities related to language, race, ethnicity, and immigrant status, among other differences, have traditionally had a low status in many societies. One result of this reconceptualization is that more education programs are reflecting and promoting a sociocultural perspective in language and literacy. That is, a perspective firmly rooted in an anthropological and sociologic understanding of culture, a view of learning as socially constructed, and an understanding of how students from diverse segments of society experience schooling due to differential access to literacy, specifically, and to education more broadly. So the context I'll be discussing today is firmly grounded in my own experience as a Puerto Rican second-generation immigrant, or as we say in New York, where I'm from, as a New Yorican in the United States. I do know people, by the way, who are Georgia Ricans. I do. And they started calling themselves that many years ago. Some, Puerto Rican lost here many years ago, and, what can I say? The kids were Georgia Ricans. And the new term that's being used now is diasporican, because we are in every place and all over the world, not just the United States. So I'm aware that there are lots of multiple and conflicting ideas about these theoretical perspectives, but some basic tenets of sociocultural theory can serve as a platform for my discussion today. So I'll explore a number of these tenets, illustrating them with examples from my own experiences to demonstrate why this perspective is invaluable in uncovering some of the tensions and dilemmas of schooling and diversity. The language of sociocultural theory includes terms such as discourse, a la James G. with a small d and a capital D that a lot of you are familiar with, habitus and cultural capital as defined by Bourdieu, hegemony as articulated by Gramsci, power and privilege as discussed by Foucault and others, social practice as defined by Street, Bloom, and others, as well as identity, hybridity, and even the very word literacy, which 20, 30 years ago was not used. We talked about reading and writing, and then literacy took over. So today these terms have become commonplace, but we'd probably be hard-pressed to find them in the literature, at least as currently used if we go back a couple of decades. So what does this mean? How has our awareness and internalization of these terms and everything they imply changed how we look at teaching and learning? So let's look at some of the assumptions underlying literacy itself. For example, it's generally accepted that certain family and home conditions promote literacy, including an abundant supply of books and other reading material at home, detailed conversations between adults and children about the books they read and other such practices, such as going to museums, taking part in cultural events, and those kinds of cultural events. So I have no doubt that this is true of many cases. And although I didn't have access to these things as a child, my husband and I, that's my husband recently, and that's me many years ago, I didn't have access to these things, but my husband and I made certain to provide them for our own children and for our grandchildren. And I hope that we've made their lives easier and fuller as a result. But what about the children for whom these conditions are not present? Should they be doomed to educational failure because their parents didn't live in the right neighborhood, weren't privileged enough to be formally educated, or didn't take their children to museums or attend plays? Should they be disqualified from learning because they didn't have books at home? The point is that, given my background and early life experiences, I shouldn't be here with you today talking about literacy and learning. Conventional and educational research would assume that my home and family situation could not have prepared me adequately for academic success. My parents came to the United States as immigrants from Puerto Rico, fleeing the unique poverty of colonialism, and they quietly took their place in the lower paid and lower status of society. I spent my first years in a fifth-floor tenement apartment. And although that's not exactly the building that I grew up in, it looks exactly like it. And the next 3 years in another equally depressing neighborhood in Brooklyn, both of which were entry points for immigrants from around the world, including my parents, Federico Cortés and Esther Mercado, who are here. My mother didn't graduate from high school, and my father never made it past 4th grade. In my family, and that's me as a baby. In my family, we never had bedtime stories, much less books. But although my father never really mastered English, he read the daily news in English religiously every day. At home, we didn't have a permanent place to study, nor did we have a desk with, quote, sufficient light and adequate ventilation, end quote, as our teachers suggested. We didn't have many toys, and I never got the piano lessons I so desperately wanted from the age of 5. Needless to say, we didn't have gymnastics, ballet, or tennis lessons, and we never learned how to ride a bike, or did we take part in any kind of sports. As a family, we didn't go to museums or other places that would give us the cultural capital described by Bourdieu that was thought to be a requisite to succeed in school. We spoke Spanish at home, even though teachers pleaded with my parents to stop doing so. And when we learned English, my sister and I spoke a non-standard, urban, Black and Puerto Rican version of English. We said ain't instead of isn't, and mine's instead of mine. And no matter how often our teachers corrected us, we persisted in saying these things. Excuse me. I'm going to do a Marco Rubio. Okay. Not politically, just, in terms of getting water. So in a word, because of our social class, ethnicity, native language, and discourse practices, we were the epitome of what were described in the United States as, quote, children at risk, disadvantaged, culturally deprived, and even problem students. I was fortunate that I had a family who, although they were unable to help me with my homework past the age of 8 or 10, they would make sure that it got done. A family who said, study, Sonia, study, as a mantra, but they kept right on speaking Spanish. Even when my sister and I switched to English, they still didn't buy books for our home, and they never read us bedtime stories. Yet my parents, just like all parents, had many skills and talents. They told us many stories and riddles and tongue twisters and jokes, and they were in the process of becoming bilingual, although I always joke that my father learned more Yiddish than English because he worked in a Jewish deli in Lower Manhattan. When the deli closed and my father bought a bodega, which looks just like that, except his was tiny and it was in a basement, so a little hole-in-the-wall grocery store, or Latin American grocery store, as we say. I was awed by the sight of him adding up a column of figures in seconds without a calculator or even a pencil. My mother embroidered beautiful and intricate patterns on handkerchiefs, blouses, and tablecloths, a trade practiced by many poor Puerto Rican women to stock the shelves of Lord & Taylor's and other fancy department stores in New York City that were beyond both our reach and our resources. These skills, however, were never called on by my teachers. Our family was simply thought of as culturally deprived and disadvantaged, another segment of the urban poor with no discernible competencies. School was an alien world. That was my school. There we were immigrants from Puerto Rico and other places in the Caribbean, and from Italy and Russia, as well as African American students. I remember one day in particular that resonates in terms of language learning. I guess I hadn't learned how to tie a bow before starting school. I can't remember. And I started school in first grade. I didn't go to kindergarten. What I do remember was feeling mute. I wrote about this incident in a book that's edited by Maria de la Luz Reyes called Words Were All We Had, Becoming Biliterate Against the Odds. This book chronicles the many obstacles that those of us who entered school knowing Spanish but who didn't yet speak English had. I had just started school, and there I was, a 6-year-old in a first grade classroom in a rundown ghetto school in Brooklyn, New York, trying to tie my hat. I didn't have the words to let my teacher know that I needed help. And imagine, I remember this so many years later, right? And I was very, very young. But I stood there gesturing and making sounds that made no sense to her, attempting to ask her to tie my hat. I felt helpless. There's much about my childhood that I do not remember, but this scene is as vivid to me today as it was, as if it were yesterday. I suppose my memory says something about the tremendous vulnerability I felt at not being able to make myself understood, the sheer panic of not having language. I did have language, of course, but the language I had was not the officially sanctioned language of school. By the end of that year, besides learning enough English to get along, as well as the rudiments of reading, I learned other valuable lessons, and here was my first aha moment. I learned that reading would open up the world to me, that learning was exciting, and that education was my best hope for a better life. In other words, I learned that literacy was important for personal enlightenment, academic learning, and improved life options. But there were other less sanguine lessons as well. I learned that it was at best an inconvenience and at worst a handicap to be Puerto Rican. I learned that English was the language of value and that although Spanish was the language of family and love and nurturing, it was also a language that had low status. I learned that school was where you learned things that were worthwhile and consequential, and that home was where you learned things that you never disclosed in school. Most of all, I learned that to get ahead, you must speak, read, and write only English. There was, in effect, a tremendous wall between home and school, and that wall was to remain intact until I became a teacher myself, and I began to question why this should be so. So I begin with my own story, not because I think that autobiography is sacrosanct, or that it's the only way to understand all educational problems. My story isn't unique, and I don't want to single myself out as a, quote, exception in the way that Richard Rodriguez ended up doing, intentionally or not, in his, what I find to be his painful autobiography, Hunger of Memory, that he wrote in that was published in 1982. He came to a very different conclusion than I have come, which was that you cannot, that losing your identity, your culture, and your language is the price you pay if you want to be successful in the United States. But I use my story simply because it underscores the fact that young people of all backgrounds can learn in spite of the language they come to school with, and that they need not be compelled, as Rodriguez felt he had to abandon their family and home language for the benefits of an education and a higher status in society. In many ways, I'm like any of the millions of young people in classrooms and schools around the world who come to school eager, although perhaps not in the current jargon, ready to learn, but who end up as the waste products of an educational system that does not understand the gifts that they bring to their education. They are the reason that I speak with you today about language, literacy, and culture, and the implications that new ways of thinking about them may have for these children. Sometime in my early adolescence, we moved from our cramped apartment and bought a small house in a lower middle class neighborhood. And I was able to attend an excellent high school. I didn't particularly like that high school. It was very famous when the years that I was there. They had more merit scholarships than any other schools except those that were that you had to take tests to get into. But it was too big and impersonal, and as one of only 3 Puerto Ricans in a student body of 5,600 students, I felt invisible there. But in retrospect, I realized that it was there that my sister and I got the quality education that we needed to prepare us for college, which was a dream beyond the wildest imagination of my parents and most of my cousins and the friends from our previous neighborhood and schools. So I had another aha moment. My new address made a profound difference in the education that I was to get. That is, my postal code guaranteed that I would receive an excellent education there. Because of that school, I eventually dropped the ain't and the minds, and I hid the fact that I spoke Spanish. I did well in school. I did very well in school. And I got into college, where I commuted daily by subway. It was in Brooklyn. I studied to be a teacher, my dream since the age of 5 or so. And in 1966, armed with a bunch of courses in methods and philosophy of education, a student teaching experience in a mostly white middle-class neighborhood, a degree in elementary education and teaching certification from New York City Public Schools, I began my teaching career in an intermediate school in an impoverished community in Brooklyn. It became clear to me rather quickly that I was facing greater challenges than I had expected. First of all, not only were my students labeled as, quote, culturally deprived, lazy, or incapable of learning, but I too, like my students, was labeled as NE for non-English. So I was called the NE teacher. But even though I was by this time perfectly fluent in English, many teachers in that school were disenchanted and tired, and some were outwardly racist and dismissive of their students. Most administrators seemed to be waiting for the day they could retire, and many of the students were unmotivated and alienated. The students, all of whom were African American and Puerto Rican, lived in poverty, many in unfair and dire circumstances. Classes were overcrowded and chaotic, not only for many of us who were novices, but for a good number of veteran teachers as well. The turnover rate at that school, by the way, was 50% a year of teachers. Yeah. So in spite of the fact that I loved my students and that many of them were capable and smart, I became disheartened. I believe I became a better teacher in the 2 years that I was in that school, learning some useful strategies, developing more self-confidence, forging close connections with my students. And I also believe that I had a positive impact on some of the students. I saw even then that it simply was not enough. But it was there that I had another aha moment. It became clear to me that structural inequality, brutal poverty, unrelenting racism, and other limiting ideologies and realities, as well as the unjust policies and practices in schools and in society in general, had as much or even more to do with my students' learning than what I could accomplish in the classroom. 2 years after I began teaching in that school, a call went out for bilingual teachers to staff a new experimental elementary school in the Bronx named PS25, the bilingual school. It's still there. And it was to become the first public school in the Northeast and only the second in the nation to use students' native languages in instruction while at the same teaching them English. Finding bilingual teachers in New York City in 1968 was not easy. In fact, in the 2 years that I had been in the system, and as a former student in that system, of the 55,000 public school teachers in the city at the time, I had never once met any teacher besides me who was either Hispanic or fluent in Spanish. I was very rare in my middle school, in my intermediate school, because they had never met a Puerto Rican teacher. But PS25 was able to find and recruit about 30 of us as bilingual teachers, about half Hispanic and the others who were white and African American who were also fluent in Spanish. After beginning my tenure at the bilingual school, my ideas about what was possible began to shift again. I used to think, as I had learned both through my own experience as a student in New York's public schools and later in my teacher education classes in college, that as a teacher, I had to leave my culture and identity at the door. I had been taught that these were peripheral to the teaching and learning experience, that they had nothing to do with intelligence or merit. As a child, my teachers made it clear to me that speaking Spanish was a problem, and this idea was reinforced in my teacher preparation program as well. But after being in the bilingual school, that's me, many years ago, for just a short time, I began to believe that language, culture, race, and ethnicity, both instructors and students, are inextricably tied to teaching, whether we admit it or not. The bilingual school is a place where language and culture were not only made visible, but were also affirmed, where they had equal status with English and mainstream American culture. It was a place where one could feel proud of speaking Spanish, something I had never before experienced, except in the company of my family. It was a place where nobody made excuses about being Puerto Rican or Cuban or Dominican, and where teachers used students' histories and realities as one important source for the curriculum. At the same time, I learned that when teachers bring their entire selves into the classroom, including their identities, they're being both true to themselves and honest with their students. Another aha moment. After being at the bilingual school for a short time, I came to realize that the role of parent involvement in the education of their children is significant. At PS25, families and parents took part in hiring new teachers, in setting the overall climate of inclusion and advocacy in the school. As a teacher, I was expected to engage in family outreach, and I learned to do so with enthusiasm. I visited my students' homes, where I was always treated like an honored guest. I communicated with families through phone calls and letters as well. This is before email and texts and all of that. And I invited family members to my classroom and to their children's exhibits and performances. Through these activities, I noticed a difference in students' attitudes and in families' acceptance and respect. A number of years later, I was hired as an instructor in the Puerto Rican Studies Department at Brooklyn College. That was before my doctorate, but they were desperate to get people who could teach about bilingual education in a co-sponsored program with the Teacher Education Department. It was a heady time for ethnic studies, where we had demonstrations and takeovers every week. Political education was part of our daily experience. Because of our demands for self-determination as a department, I was arrested as one of the BC 44 for taking over the registrar's office. As a result of being steeped in the politics of the 1960s and 70s, I had another aha moment. In the words of Frederick Douglass, the iconic 19th century freed slave and abolitionist, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. At Brooklyn College, I learned about the efficacy of agency and the possibility of social change. Given my experience of struggle and learning both as a classroom teacher and as a teacher educator at Brooklyn College, I decided to pursue doctoral studies. I loved higher education, and I knew that teacher education would be my life's work. So we moved to Massachusetts, where I studied at the University of Massachusetts, and that's our School of Education. My doctoral studies were transformative. In my 4 years there, I learned, for example, that our society's structural inequality made it almost impossible for students of color and all students living in poverty to get a fair shake in education. The research of Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, who were two of my professors at UMass, as well as the theories of Martin Carnoy, Michael Apple, Joel Spring, James Banks, among others, reinforced this idea. Maxine Green, of course, who was mentioned, Joel Spring. These scholars and others made invaluable contributions to education by disabusing us of the pie in the sky myths about education being the so-called great equalizer, while also affirming the significance of culture, language, and race in teaching and learning. For example, through their work, Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, who wrote Schooling in Capitalist America, they were two of my professors at UMass, and they used the galleys from their book as our text in the class. So they demonstrated that without a shadow of a doubt, privilege begets privilege, and conventional myth to the contrary, climbing up the ladder of success is no easy matter in an unequal society. They proved, for example, that it is a father's income that makes the most difference in whether a child will get a good education and future opportunities or not. The idea of meritocracy and fair play, I learned, were largely myths. Gloria Anzaldúa was one of the first Latina theorists I encountered, and it was riveting for me to read her words about the power of language and culture. She helped me understand why, as a Spanish speaker in a rigidly English-dominant society, and in spite of my many years of education and professional merits, I still felt like an outsider. She wrote, "So if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. I am my language." This close connection that we each have with our home language leads to curious things. For example, I still find myself automatically speaking Spanish to babies. It is the language in which I was nurtured and loved as a child. I also speak Spanish to dogs and cats, although English comes out automatically in academic situations. So, for example, when I've been asked to speak in Spain, it's hard for me to speak academically in Spanish, and something that I have to work on. But hegemonic language practices go much further than personal idiosyncrasies. They can keep people in their place, that is, positions of subservience and powerlessness. Through the work of Paulo Freire, who we were privileged to host at the University of Massachusetts for several month-long visits in the 1980s, and that's us in 1983, I learned that education is always political. That is, that regardless of the pedagogy or practice in which we engage, it inevitably says something about our ideology, whether we think it does or not. All educational decisions, the books and curricula we use, our relationships with our students, our perspectives about their identities, how we set up our classroom, what we put on the walls, the choice of which language to teach or to teach in, or how to teach reading. All of these decisions, large and small, say something about who we are and what we believe, and consequently, about the kind of education our young people deserve and receive. All of these theories were powerful, and given my experience as a teacher and later a teacher educator, they made a great deal of sense to me. Even though I had, quote, made it because of education, I knew that I was in a tiny minority among my Puerto Rican peers. And it wasn't because, I was so talented that they had to pick me out of 1,000. It was because I got the breaks that I had. It was because I had the family that I had that was able to push me. But I went to school with so many smart people who never even graduated from high school. So although I've never given up on education, I recognize that it has serious implications. Nevertheless, I believe that what teachers can do, although partial, is also significant. I've learned that literacy is not just about teaching the mechanics of reading or imparting information to students. Rather, it's always either advocacy for or against the students whom we teach. In the words of Paulo Freire, we are political militants because we are teachers. So I want to spend the rest of the time this afternoon with some lessons from these aha moments for preparing teachers with both critique and hope. Let's see where I am. A friend of mine has a sweatshirt that says, "Old age is not for sissies." She wears it to our exercise class. And in the same way, I say that teaching is not for sissies. Instead, teaching is for those with courage and a critical mind. And that's why critique is important. And we also need hope, because without it, we can become disenchanted, disillusioned, and burned out. Without both critique and hope, teachers are swallowed up by a system that is inequitable and hegemonic, that replicates power and privilege, and that rewards students according to their identities and postal codes. So I'll use the words of some of the teachers and students with whom I've had the privilege to work to illustrate these lessons. Relationships are at the heart of teaching. Literacy is a social practice that can't be separated from the socio-political context in which it takes place. Teaching students to become critical learners is a key role for educators. And teaching is advocacy for a more socially just world. So relationships are at the heart of teaching. I was a visiting professor last year at Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, South Africa, where I spent about 5 weeks. And I taught some classes, I gave lectures, and so on. When I asked university students, these were undergraduate students in South Africa, about teachers who made a difference in their lives, they rarely mentioned content. Although, of course, content is absolutely essential because teachers need to become experts in their subject matter. But while content is important, these students reaffirmed what we already know, that is that relationships must be the bedrock of any learning. And these are the kinds of things that they said. You know, she made me feel safe. He believed in me, and so on. So when asked about memorable teachers, most people, like the students I asked in South Africa, will most likely mention the attitudes, values, and behaviors of teachers who made a difference rather than the subject matter that they taught. That's because teachers who are successful with students inevitably become sociocultural mediators. That is, they learn about their students, they help them negotiate academic spaces, and they affirm their identities while helping them to explore the world beyond their limited realities, because we all have limited realities. So literacy is a social practice that can't be separated from the socio-political context in which it takes place. This is Mary Ginley. I spoke about her last night for those who were there. She wrote for a journal that she was keeping in one of my classes many years ago, something that we ended up titling, "Being Nice is Not Enough." She had taught children of all different socioeconomic, racial, and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. At the time, she was teaching in a largely Puerto Rican community, and most of her students came to school without knowing English and lived in great poverty. So being nice is not enough. She said, every child needs to feel welcome, to feel comfortable. School is a foreign land to most kids. Where else in the world would you spend time circling answers and filling in the blanks? But the more distant the child's culture and language are from the culture and language of the school, the more at risk that child is. A warm, friendly, helpful teacher is nice, but it isn't enough. We have plenty of warm, friendly teachers who tell the kids nicely to forget their Spanish and ask mommy and daddy to speak to them in English at home, who give them easier tasks so they won't feel badly when the work becomes too difficult, who never learn about what life is like at home or what they eat or the music that they like or what stories they've been told or what their history is. Instead, we smile and give them a hug and tell them to eat our food and listen to our stories and dance to our music. We teach them to read with our words and wonder why it's so hard for them. We ask them to sit quietly and we'll tell them what's important and what they need to know to, quote, get ready for the next grade. We never ask them who they are and where they want to go. So this issue of who they are and where they want to go is a deeply political question because it acknowledges that literacy and teaching are about whose story is being told. Teach students to question and to be curious. While it's important to teach students skills and competencies if they're to negotiate the world successfully, teachers also need to teach students to be critical. This means teaching them to not only read the word, but as Paulo Freire said, to read the world as well. This means teaching students to probe, to be curious, and to question. What does this mean in practice? It means that literacy is not only a social practice, but also a political practice. as Paulo Freire reminds us when he wrote, I say reading is not just to walk on the words, and it is not flying over the words either. Reading is rewriting what we are reading. A good example comes from Ron Morris. That's not him, but I can't show his real picture. An African-American student we interviewed about 20 years ago for a case study that we put into Affirming Diversity in the first edition. Ron was about maybe 17 years old at the time. He talked about the first class in which he had ever been interested, a class on Black history in 8th grade. Until that time, he had never learned anything about African American history in school. Surely a terrible indictment of education in a nation with approximately 40 million African Americans. Except for that class, Ron was known as a troublemaker, a kid who was alienated both in and out of school. He had never connected to school until school connected to him. This is what he said about that class. It was basically about Black people, but it showed you all people instead of just Black people. It showed us Latinos, it showed us Caucasians, it showed us the Jews and everything, how we all played a part in what society in any country is like today. I'd sit in that class and I would just be like, I was just so relaxed. I just felt like the realest person on earth. That always gets me, that quote. What will it take until every young person feels like the realest person on earth? For one, it means making learning relevant to students' lives and respectful of their identities, while also teaching them to question everything, including their own assumptions, values, and even their own identities. And finally, understand that teaching is about advocacy for social and political change. This means asking profoundly multicultural questions. This is something that I wrote about a number of years ago when, in educational leadership, they had asked me to write an article on culture and learning. And I'm always afraid that people are going to take that and make it into a laundry list of things that you do. Okay, this is how Latino students learn, and so this is what we have to do. So instead of that, I wrote this article called Profoundly Multicultural Questions. And what I meant by that was that because multicultural education and all good education should be about equity and access, that it's not just about the curriculum, but it's about, who gets to learn, who has access, and how equitable that access is. That it means asking what I called profoundly multicultural questions, such as, who's in the gifted and talented program? That to me is a profoundly multicultural question, because without it, we're going to see monocultural, talented and gifted classrooms. Or another profoundly multicultural question is, where is the bilingual program located? Is it in the basement? Is it next to the boiler? And there's always good reasons for all this. Principals say, well, we didn't have any room for it, but the gifted and talented program is never in the basement. So that's what I meant. So unless teachers understand that teaching is advocacy for social and political change, inequities will continue to exist. We need to teach our pre-service and practicing teachers to ask the kinds of questions that educators such as Maxine Green, Michael Apple, Paulo Freire, and Hilary Jenks, among others, ask. What's the content of the curriculum? Who's included? Who's left out? Whose language is affirmed? Whose culture is valued? And the quintessential questions posed by Paulo Freire: who benefits and who loses? Understand that teaching is advocacy for social and political change. I want to give the example of Hyung Nam, who is one of the teachers who I'm featuring in my new book. He's a high school social studies teacher in Portland, Oregon. He's been teaching for 11 years, and lucky for him, he started teaching at the same school as Bill Bigelow. And oh my goodness, who wrote Reading, Writing, and Rising Up? Linda Christensen, thank you. And they were both teaching at that school. And so right away, he became involved with teachers from the organization Rethinking Schools. He said he was amazed when he found them because he had never before met a group of activist teachers. He joined the group immediately, and he's been an active participant ever since. He said he probably would have given up as a teacher if he hadn't found the group, which is a lesson for all teachers, that you need to find allies and friends to help you keep going. Otherwise, it's really difficult. So he said, I feel inspired and really empowered and honored to be in a role where I could help students to question the world and expand their horizons, and to see the possibility that they can be agents in the world to change the world to be a better place. I see part of my job is to agitate. You know, if we think about the kind of society, the dominant mainstream society that we have, that's kind of why I'm a teacher, is to agitate and make people think and question things. So it would be easy to throw up our hands and say that education is too full of contradictions. And I've heard these things, you know, that it preaches what it can't deliver, that it's a utopian dream. And all these things may be true. Yet, as Paulo Freire reminds us, the educator's biggest problem is not to discuss whether education can or cannot accomplish, but to discuss where it can, how it can, with whom it can, when it can. It is to recognize the limits his or her practice imposes. Living through the contradictions, although not easy, is an essential obligation for both teachers and teacher educators. My aha moments have helped me understand not just my own reality, but also the realities of and lives of others around the world. This is why I believe that it's our responsibility as educators, and especially as teacher educators, to engage teachers in just this kind of introspection, the kind of reflection that demands an honest and rigorous understanding of their own position in the world and of what it has to do with the profession they've chosen. When they do these things, they will be better prepared to connect in authentic and caring ways with their students, because they'll understand that sociocultural and sociopolitical understandings of the world are not just personal aha moments, but rather moments of transcendence and transformation. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes. I'd be happy to engage in dialogue, conversation. Oh no, I quieted all of you down, didn't I? Yeah, you know, I think that the biggest challenge and the biggest obstacle is that teachers themselves have had a monocultural education and a monolingual for the most part. You know, I happen to be bilingual, not because of what I learned in school, but because of my own family background. I happen to attempt to be multicultural because it's a never-ending process, not because of what I learned in school, but because of what I've done in my own life, of trying to be more inclusive and to learn. And so that means that teachers who themselves have had very little experience with a multicultural reality have to understand that their role is to always be a researcher and always keep learning. And so you don't have to do the world in your classroom to be a multicultural educator. Start with the kids who you have in your own classroom. That alone would make such a huge change. But constantly keep learning. You know, I think that it's important to understand that you don't become a teacher You're not finished being a teacher when you graduate and you get into the classroom. No, that's when you start. And you have to keep going and going and going, and hopefully always learning. You know, I was telling somebody the other day that I'm like a learning junkie, you know, because I always love to learn. And I find it fascinating, especially to learn about differences, about different people, what their lives are like. You have to have that kind of energy, I think, and passion if you're going to attempt to be a multicultural educator. And yes, I've heard all of the objections, all of the buts. But how can I do that? But, you know, and so I always say, look, take it one day at a time. Do one thing that's different each week. And by the end of the year, you'll have done a lot that's different. But don't just throw up your hands. That's why I said that, because people sort of throw up their hands and say, what can I do? The problems are so big. Yes, they are. But, you know, this reminds me of another Paulo Freire moment. When he was giving he never gave talks. When he was having a dialogue with 600 people in an auditorium in Vermont, he never gave a talk. In fact, I still remember that time that he was in Vermont, he went on stage and he sat down. And he waited and waited and waited until finally somebody got up and said, so Paulo, what do you think about such and such? And that's how it started. He never gave a talk, but his answers were like 20 minutes long. So somebody said to him, but Paulo, you know, it's so difficult to make the kinds of changes that you're talking about, that you were able to make in Brazil, but in the United States, you know, that's really hard. And Paulo just looked at him and said, and they say the third world is fatalistic. It was a wonderful response, because he said, you live in the most powerful and the richest country in the world, and you say this, you know? So there's always hope, and I think that's what we have to remember. You can't do everything at once, but you can do so much if you start little by little. Anybody else? Yes. Misha.
What you said about, that all education is political, and those of us involved in cultural education often get accused of being too political. And I wanted to understand I think there is a difference between an education that's political and they're trying to evangelize. Or
Yes, right.
And
Yeah.
you model a kind of humility and walking that line. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think we all have to realize that we don't have all the answers. You know, God knows, we don't even know all the questions. But to try to open up people's minds so that they understand that there are other ways of looking at the world. And that's why I said we all have limited realities. My reality is limited. And so I have to learn from others what their reality is like. And it's like Hyung, the teacher who I mentioned before. He said that he tries to work with his students so that they understand that there's not necessarily a right answer all the time and a wrong answer all the time. But that maybe if we dialogue, we can come up with the best answer for now. And I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Not for everything, of course. You know, yes, there are some right answers for some things, but not for the deeply complicated questions that we have about life. So I think that when I say political, I'm not saying, first of course, I'm not saying Democrat or Republican, at all. And I'm not even saying just one way of looking at things. It makes me laugh sometimes and angry other times when people say that multicultural education is about being PC, politically correct. And I think, no. PC is about what we have now. It's one way of looking at things. If you look at the curriculum, most of the curriculum is about one way of looking at things. A multicultural perspective will open that up so that there are many truths to be had and to be learned. and to struggle with. And we all have our bottom lines, of course. You know, we all say, well, this is one thing that I won't negotiate on. But even there, I think if we leave room for dialogue, I think that's incredibly important. So, you know, that's how I try to do it, as a teacher, as a writer. Anybody else? Yes, Peter.
I agree with pretty much everything you said today, and I suspect that a lot of us do. And I'm thinking, I'm also working on a paper on teacher assessment, teacher evaluation, which is becoming increasingly monocultural
Yes,
and
absolutely.
monologic,
Yeah.
such that all the qualities you described today, which I endorse and admire in teachers, don't get counted
Yeah.
in the evaluations of teachers.
Yeah.
So, and this is the biggest tension I see emerging from your talk is, I think we would embrace these ideas, and then if someone goes back in a school, no one, you know, the assessment system is blind to the issues you raise for us. And
Yeah.
so I guess I'm just expressing a frustration that, you know, this ongoing frustration that the things that I value and the things that I see in good teaching simply do not get recognized in the homogenization of teachers and students in the current reform movement.
I agree with you. And that's why I'm not only a researcher and an academic, but an activist and an advocate. And so that's what I think educators have to be, because they are whether they think they are or not. You know, because you're either agreeing with the status quo or you're struggling against the status quo in some way. And I think that's what we have to keep on doing, because I don't think that it will always be like this. I'm a hopeful person, you know, and I think that we can make change. Yes.
I like your idea about the parent involvement in schools, but I would also like to see more of the community involved in the school system. Right now, we struggle with having the deaf community in the school. Because many people think they can't be involved. You know, those parents can't be involved. They have children in the schools, yes, but they can't be involved. And you see that in other communities as well. I think it's parallel.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I have to say that when I went to my first AERA conference in 1980, and that's American Educational Research Association, for those who might not know, and I presented my research, which was on parent involvement in bilingual education in the Puerto Rican community, particularly in curriculum development. And one of the people on the panel, who I didn't know at all, responded. You know, he was one of the respondents on the panel, and he said, well, that all sounds very good, but we know that Puerto Rican parents can't really be involved in curriculum development. I stayed away from AERA for 8 years as a result of that, but I went back. So I agree with you. I think you're right. And again, it has to be through advocacy that certain groups are represented in the school. You know, in the bilingual school where I taught, for example, there was a parent room right next to the principal's office. That made it very clear what was important in that school. There were classes for parents, you know, workshops for parents. Parents were involved in hiring, and so on and so forth. So I think, and this was, of course, as I said before, a heady time for political activism. But I think it can be again, and I think that certainly, I mean, look at Gallaudet. That's a real good example of activism and how things changed at that university. So I think it's that kind of activism and advocacy that are important. Yes, one more, and then I know it's time for people to go.
You touched on the literature of so many different aspects of, you know, sort of art, education, everything from creativity, language, and literacy, multicultural, being culturally responsive in our classrooms. If we could sort of arbitrarily make you emperor of schools for a day, what would be something practicable and implementable that you would like to see done within the current framework of what we're doing in schools?
Well, I would change the way that teachers are assessed, Peter. That's the first thing that I would do. And, and I'd look for more equitable ways of assessing teachers, because I think there are so many talented teachers out there, and we're not listening to what they have to tell us. And there are a lot of teachers who are burned out, and there are teachers who shouldn't be in the classroom, and we have to find ways to get them out, while we also support the teachers who should be there. But I think we lose so many teachers who are burned out because they don't see that there's a place for them. They joined the profession with a particular intention in mind, and they don't see that happening. So that's one thing that I would do. But there are so many changes that we can make. The other day I was talking about professional development to a group, and I was saying that why do we have these workshops or presentations for, you put 500 teachers in an auditorium and expect that they're going to sit there and enjoy somebody coming in and telling them what to do. And so, of course, teachers are not. My daughter's a teacher, and she said, that kind of professional development is iffy. It's iffy. And so I would change professional development. I would see what teachers wanted to learn and get them in small groups to inquire and do research about what they want to learn. Now, clearly there are some things that a lot of groups of teachers may not want to learn about their own privilege, about how they're being oppressive in their policies and practices, but we can get at those things when we have those inquiry groups. So I would definitely do that. And I would change professional development so that, like one of the teachers in my new book said, once we went to the museum, we just said, okay, we're taking off, and rather than sit in a workshop, they went to the museum and they talked about interpreting the art that they saw, and that helped them think about how they were teaching. Another way is, I think every school should have professional development that includes walks around the neighborhood, just to get to know what the neighborhood offers. Otherwise, some teachers don't know the communities in which they teach. Walk around the neighborhood, meet the bodega owner, like my father, was. Meet the the person who's sweeping the street, or the garbage collector. And not only what our tradition called the community helpers, the doctor, the dentist, the teacher, and so on, but those who are from different classes, different social classes. Meet the people in the community and see what they have to offer. So I think that would change so much. But not just meet them, then come back and talk about what you saw, because otherwise your perceptions and stereotypes might just be replicated unless you really have a chance to process all of that. So, thanks for the question. I will not be emperor, but thanks.